Good evening. Thank you for coming to the pre-concert talk, and we're thrilled to have this distinguished panel of Leila Josefowicz, who's going to play this evening, an amazing pianist, Catherine Saylor, who's a wonderful conductor, as well as a wonderful pianist. I can testify to that because we used to play together. And Linda Wang, who is the chair of the strings department at DU and an amazing violinist as well. Welcome, and we thought it would be interesting and important to talk about, to acknowledge and honor Women's History Month, and what better way to do that than to have a distinguished panel of women in classical music who will answer some questions for us, and if we have time at the end, answer some questions from you as well. So we're going to start with Leila. What meaningful changes do you see for women today in classical music, and do we still have a long way to go?
These are hard-hitting questions.
This is just one of many on the... I think there's been a lot of headway, is the short answer. The longer answer, I think, is more complex because it doesn't really have to do with classical music. It just has to do more with society, men and women, the changes and the differences that can... Not changes, sorry. The differences between men and women and how much certain women want it to change or not, and how much certain men want it to change or not.
Okay, I need to ask you what that means, how much women want it to change. Could you elaborate on that?
There are some women, I think, that are perfectly happy with things as they are. I know that's not what we're used to hearing these days, but there are some women who feel that way, I think. Not us, but it just depends on how society is built, I think, and the different roles that people want to play in society, and how many people are proportionately in these different camps. There are some people who still don't think a woman should conduct. And it's, as many people don't agree with that, there are still some people that do. And it's just gonna be kind of a fight for quite a long time. I mean, I'm speaking very candidly. There's some very conservative thinkers out there and some very sexist thinkers, and then we have the others.
Catherine, could you comment on the people who don't think women should conduct? And have you run into that? Have you had that experience?
I have had the experience.
Well, if I can just, sorry, I think most women conductors have had that experience, to be honest,
yes,
right?
I would agree. We've all sort of had that at some point, and it's not always, sometimes it comes across in a very sort of gentle way. It's not necessarily like, you shouldn't conduct. It's a sort of a, oh, bless your heart, kind of condescending sort of approach. So I don't know that it's always intended as strongly as it feels to us sometimes. But yeah, we do get that sometimes. I definitely get that more in the orchestral side of the coin. I conduct orchestra, but I also conduct choirs. And the orchestra world is, it is still quite a bit more closed off for women. It's just a little bit trickier for us to get podium time. And Alix and I were backstage sort of naming off the women conductors, and we got to the end of that list of well-known, folks pretty quickly. I mean, so it is quite unusual, I guess, to see a woman in that position. I'm lucky enough that it doesn't feel unusual to me because I grew up watching Marin Alsop. So it wasn't an oddity, it was the norm for me to see Marin Alsop. And then when I moved to Chicago, I didn't see another woman on the podium the entire time I was in school out there. And it took me a while before it hit me, like, oh, wait a minute, why is it that the only one I've ever seen is Marin? Yeah, I think we do still have that. You know, it is
the
what it is.
The changes I've seen as a violin soloist have been incredible. I mean, there are more women conductors now than there have ever been.
Absolutely. There are a lot more women conductors, and I think they're also a lot more comfortable being feminine in the position. I think that first round felt like they had to be very, very
Susanna
strong.
Malky as well. A lot of these incredible women were they had to be so strong to break this, preconceived notions of that no women can be on the podium. And they really paid for that, I think. They're incredibly strong heroines.
Yes, and absolutely, the second generation, I think we're in a lot better shape. And then the ones coming up next are even better off. The ones who are graduating from conservatory now have a lot more opportunities. And I think there are a lot of people who are excited to give them opportunities and things. But yeah, it's a pretty slow turnover if you look at the major orchestras.
Linda, as a soloist who's played all over the world, what's your experience in women conductors in other countries, or is this a universal sort of issue?
Well, I'll just comment similarly to what we've been hearing. I guess for the Trailblazers, I remember the first time I worked with Jolene Fuelletta, for instance, and that she was one of those that came from, well, I can actually say maybe unemployment for many years. Yeah, she was not treated well. And then she had the Women's Philharmonic for some time, and they were trailblazers in programming women composers, having a full orchestra of women, but it took a while for her to actually find her place. Yeah, so I piggyback on a lot of the comments that we've been hearing already.
I think the other area that Friends of Chamber Music has been interested in is trying to find compositions written by women. And I wonder if you could all comment about your search over the last 5 years of seeking and finding women composers, and is that a little bit of an easier road to travel than as a conductor?
I play a new violin concerto by Helen Grime, the Welsh composer, who I think is sensational. But I would say that my upbringing and my youth in the 80s and 90s were still very much part of the older ways of thinking. So I see so much more improvement and change and diversity in this area as well. I mean, there was a period when I started playing newer music in my early 20s that, any composer wasn't played very often. I mean, male composers weren't performed very often, let alone female composers. So when I look back to that time, I think it's, greatly improved.
I think the youth don't see the difference as much as we do. So the way we were educated was so different.
In school, my teachers most of them were over 80 and male. And this was just completely normal.
Yeah.
This was wonderful. This was, the pedagogy of classical music. I had incredible personalities and people who knew Bartók and Berg and this is what I was used to. I was 15 and my teacher was 81, 82. Many of them.
Similarly, but I had two very wonderful women mentors, Dorothy DeLay, of course, and then Alice Schoenfeld, so they were also in their 80s. But they were handling in a very different way, being a woman in the teaching profession at that time. Yeah.
Catherine, what's your experience with women composers?
I think this is one that's a lot easier in the choral world, because the choral world tends to embrace contemporary music a little bit more than the orchestral world. The orchestral world, often that's the 15-minute overture, and then there's something more traditional in the second half, whereas the choral world, we'll spend 80% of our program on living composers and like 20% on historical composers frequently. And so it's easier to include a wider range when you're talking about the modern repertoire. The search has to go on a little bit more when we're doing historic rep. And, but even then, I think the choral world is a little bit ahead there. We have Hildegard. So
Can you
we
talk
start
a little,
there.
just could you give a little snapshot of what kind of a human she was?
Snapshot of it. So Hildegard was living in a monastery in Bingen, Germany, and wrote the most amazing chant. And we tend to think of chant as having not very large leaps, right? Stepwise motion, really kind of humble and meditative. And hers were just flamboyantly wonderful. And she's the first composer of whose name that we know that we do in the choral rep. And that's standard. That's a standard part of our teaching. And I do always make sure that we include everyone back to her. The Fanny Hensels and all of that, so that it's not only modern. That's where I work. The modern female composers, that's easy. I can program those for days. But historic ones, there just aren't as many represented, so I have to do a little bit more digging there. But it's not hard. There's a lot of great ones.
It happens to be a sort of organic thing, but I'm recording next week an album of related to love, basically. But there happens to be 3 women composers that I'm using: Florence Price. So you're speaking of people that were from the Romantic era already, and Amy Beach, and Chen Yi, who is contemporary. But all of their voices, I'm just mixing it in because I just happen to be looking for different perspectives of love. It wasn't really intentional to have women composers, but it would be lovely if some of these wonderful pieces became more standard. I feel that, something like the Rebecca Clark sonata, in the viola repertoire is studied by everybody these days, and I think that we need to get to the point where these become part of our regular curriculum.
How does that happen? I mean, because Rebecca Clark wrote in the 40s, didn't she?
Yeah.
So, and her viola sonata is sort of a bulwark of that.
Absolutely.
But you don't hear it very often. So how does one get those works into the canon so that they're a regular part of the system?
I think it's a bit contagious. I mean, like during the pandemic, so many students were working on Jessie Montgomery's pieces because it was solo, it was short, it was representing both women and Black or African American. I don't know what even now quite what people say. And the students actually bring a lot of interesting pieces to me. And then the other students want to learn it. Carolyn Shaw, we've had some quartets, and she's very popular. So I'm seeing that the students are the one initiating it, and then others want to study it more. Yeah. Yes. I've had a student bring a whole program of female composers to me of pieces
when I think about
I didn't know.
In school, in Curtis Institute of Music, I was the only one playing Bartók and Berg, because that was considered new. So that'll show you how far things have come right now. I mean, when you look at how the mentality around that.
Yeah, and your recordings are becoming like standard for others to listen to. So it really sets. So I think it really is important that they're studied and people are recording them. The more that it's more the exposure, the more normal it becomes per se.
So where would you each say the most progress has been made for women in classical music? And the second part of the question is, where does most work still need to be done?
I would say the conductors. I mean, I would say like in music, I mean, I think contemporary music is leaping forward, but by all composers, not just women, men as well. But I mean, when I look at like the massive shift on the podium, to me that would be my answer. But I'm curious what you guys would say.
I think blind auditions have been amazing.
I think blind auditions, because if you look at the makeup of a symphony orchestra now, a professional orchestra, is mostly women now.
Yeah,
And that's because of blind auditions.
It was completely changed the game, not to have that bias. I think most of you understand what a blind audition means. It's like behind the screen, so we don't know who's playing, and it's made a huge difference for performers, I think.
And of course, you can't do that with conductors.
That's
No.
true.
Yeah. We don't have blind auditions, but we hold blind auditions. And yeah, I think that's
And well,
different.
then there's the question of tenure that comes after, though. So, I mean, they still have the biases to deal with. I have a sister that's working on a film called, about the first percussionist, female percussionist to win a job in the San Francisco Symphony. And in fact, there was no interest in this until more recent years. I mean, she just recently got an NIH grant, and after, winning the San Francisco Symphony job, and 2 years later, she did not get her tenure. Yeah, so, but that's a while ago, but still, there's things to overcome, and that's the history, I guess, we're coming from.
Catherine, would you agree that conducting is the area that needs the most attention?
Well, that's not, you were saying the opposite. I thought you were saying that conducting
sorry.
is doing well. I would agree. I think that conducting is not as far along as performing, as far as that gender gap. I think there's the pay issue is one that is important, that even in the same positions, even if you get the job, you're generally paid a little less than your counterparts.
For sure, this is true. But I mean, again, when I was in school, there was like almost there was nothing.
Nothing.
So I guess
We've come
my bar is
so
kind
far.
of maybe it's too low in that sense.
Wait, when you say nothing, what does that mean?
I mean, like there was Marin Alsa and Susanna Malky, and they were like, whoa, it was a big deal. And now there's so many young female conductors, I don't even know a lot of them. So only in that sense. I mean, with all the other things to do with that, yes, I'm sure it's completely, as you're saying.
Everything is better, right? Everything is better. And there's always more to do, but I think everything is better. One thing that I really like is I think we don't have to make a big deal about a lot of things. I never say in my rehearsal or to a board, and I programmed this piece by a woman composer. I just go, we've got this piece by so-and-so, and we've got this piece by so-and-so, and it's just on the list, and I just pass it out to the ensemble, and it's just making sure that we think it's totally normal. It's not a women's history event or a whatever, it's just, we can play them in October.
The other really tricky thing about all of this is that, whatever we are, we want to be respected for the skills that we put forward. And we want to be respected for those, not because we're a woman or or a man, we just want, I have been focused on my skill since my very early youth and not really focused on, other things.
So there's a young string quartet, the Aizuri Quartet, and they were going to appear in our series, and then COVID happened. And they did a video recording, and we did an interview with them beforehand. And I asked them something about, well, you're an all-female ensemble, and you're playing a program of all-female composers. And they very gently said, well, when we put our quartet together, we determined who was the best fit. How did the four of us relate to each other? And if it had been a man, it would have been fine. It just so happened that we all clicked. And the music that we play, we chose because they're fine compositions. So
I don't think we would all want to be chosen because we're a woman, or we want to be chosen because of our skill.
do your students, it seems to me that young people are going to be the ones who sort of lead us in progress. Do your students, they're blind pretty much to these issues of gender, and they I think are much more geared towards being competent, fine musicians and being true to the music as opposed to any kind of agenda. Is that your experience with your students, Linda and Catherine?
I can go. I feel like, yeah, my students don't think of themselves as male or female conductors. They just want to be good conductors, so I think that's really true. I do have, the one thing that's a little bit different is I have more of my women students that want to talk to me in a work-life balance mentoring conversation. I get more of those conversations from my female students than I do from my male students. How do you have a child, and how do you deal with all, how do you handle that balance? So I get those questions more, but I don't get, so much, is it okay for me to do this? And when I first started here, I've been teaching at DU for about 20 years. It's my first job at a school. And I tended to I have always had male and female students, but at the beginning I felt like when I would get female students, I thought, am I only getting them because they want to study with a female conductor or something? And I got over that as well. So I had to just realize they're just here to study with me and they don't really care either.
Leila's got to go because she's got another obligation.
I have to show you my skills. Thank you so much. And you continue this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Linda, do you want to take about students and how they're going to make us progress? And
Oh, I mean, they're very forward-looking in terms of, and gender, I mean, again, it's so fluid these days, so, I mean, they don't even identify necessarily as male or female. So, yeah, it's a different generation.
One question I have is, what do you think is the most helpful way to promote hearing more pieces written by women composers, seeing more women on the podium? What are some of the ways we can support that?
Well, you run a concert series, so I think that it's very important for promoters, for instance, to bring in and encourage these things. Like you said, like you mentioned, having a female group plays female composers. I mean, even that little bit of encouragement is good, I think. Just resources, support in general, opportunities that, no. I lost track.
Yeah, no, I would say, yeah, programming, repertoire programming, soloist programming. I mean, chamber music doesn't necessarily program a lot of conductors. So you are off the hook for that. But, I think the thing that helps anyone in the arts is people showing up to concerts, right? Whatever the concert is, I think it is so important. The audience is the biggest factor in all of this. And, it's not just the financial bit of someone paying for their ticket. It's having that face out in the audience, and knowing that someone's hearing what you are trying to share. So I think go to things, and we need to go to things that aren't just our own things. But yeah, I think that's the best way to be supportive is to keep different things alive.
I think the other area, and we've talked about this from stage, is commissioning works. And we had Amy Williams, who was here when the Junction Trio was here, and we, Friends of Chamber Music, partially commissioned a piece called Bells and Whistles. And she's on the composition faculty at the University of Pittsburgh. And actually, John and Leila are commissioning a work by a young British composer named Charlotte Bray. And there are all sorts. The Danish String Quartet have next month is embarking on a North American tour. They're not going to be here, unfortunately, this time. But one of the pieces they are premiering is a piece written by Anna Thorvaldsdottir, who's a very prominent Icelandic composer. So there are a lot of ways. That's one way I think that you can actually fund somebody and produce an interesting work that will live on in posterity. So I think we might have some time for questions if anyone would like to shout out a question. Yes.
Okay, thank you. She was asking, in case you couldn't hear, what I needed to do to become a conductor, if I needed to learn a bunch of instruments, and what my schooling looked like. So and I can answer sort of my journey and not everybody's, but I think most conductors need to be really proficient on an instrument. So for me, that's primarily the piano, and I did them side by side, and I continue to play the piano, even though it's not my primary employment. I still play mostly ensemble things to stay sharp and to sit on the other side and know what it feels like when you just want them to be clear and let me play my part. So I think that's an important thing, is to be able to play your instrument. So for me, it's mostly piano. I also played flute. I did a lot of study on strings, even though I'm not a real string player, but I took all the bowing classes and I did a lot of Suzuki cello just so that I could have a better conversation with real string players. And then study-wise, I conducted anyone and anything that would let me. There's no undergraduate program for conducting. So my undergrad is in piano. Some people will maybe do like a music ed or something like that. But for the most part, you're just sort of carving your own path until you get to graduate school. So for me, that looked like being a drum major in high school with the marching band, with the hat, with the feather plume. I've never seen Marin wear that. So handbell choir at my church. I conducted the percussion ensemble in undergrad. I took every class that was offered and put on my own recitals, non-required recitals, just so that I could do things. And just anything that I could possibly do. Study-wise, you're not really officially a conducting major until graduate school. My primary teachers are all male, and they were great. They gave me a lot of great opportunities, huge experience. So it is one thing I want to make sure that is clear, at least for my experience, is that, sometimes things don't work out because of biases or whatever, but also a lot of great things happened by a lot of nice men giving me opportunities to conduct their ensembles. So you're a bit of a beggar, because you can't just do it on your own. So you're like, please, can I do something? So I was everyone's assistant, everyone's whatever, so that I could maybe cover for them in a rehearsal or something. So there's a lot of working for free and a lot of working for cheap in order to do all that. And then I went to Northwestern, and at Northwestern I studied choral and orchestral, but I also discovered a woman named Mallory Thompson, who is the wind ensemble conductor at Northwestern, and talk about a trailblazer. She's the only one I know in the band world of that caliber, and she's amazing. And I studied with her for a year as well, and again, I was like, whatever I can do. So yeah, conducting is different because we can't practice for real. Everything is imagined and analyzed and advanced. And it would be like as if Linda just sat at home and considered her fingering and considered her bowing and studied the piece and the history of the piece and imagined what sound she wanted, but never actually made a sound until she was in front of people. That's what we do. It's just a little bit weird. I don't know why I chose it, but it's the right match for me.
That's kind of a terrifying thought, isn't it?
But we get to face, we don't have to face the audience. We just turn around.
Other questions?
Oh, perfect. For you. Now this is for you.
Everybody asks me this.
Of course.
I have not seen the movie.
What? You're kidding.
know.
The question was, could the panel comment on the movie Tar? And when Catherine got here, I said, okay, what'd you think? She said, I haven't seen it. So, have you seen it?
I have, and she's so good in it.
So, I think there's universal agreement that Cate Blanchett's
Was amazing.
performance was astonishing. But the depiction, and I think Marin Ossoff has commented on this, so I don't think I'm giving away any state secrets, that she's really a very unpleasant person.
Yeah.
And so it's a little disappointing that that she's such a villain because, you know, I don't know. But there's also the documentary about Marin Ossoff. I don't know if people have seen that, and that's a much more realistic depiction of a human being, I think. So, you know, the very end of Tar is one of the most stunning endings I've ever seen in a movie. Yeah, it's well worth seeing. Linda, what did you think?
Yeah, well worth seeing. Yeah. Leave it at that.
Other questions? All right. Thank you for coming, and it's going to be a spectacular concert, and we will see you soon. Thank you.